Welcome to the final presentation of the event. This is going to be presented to you by Benoit, who is the Design Program Manager at Meta. His presentation is entitled Implementing Processes, a Story of Collaboration and Compromise. And that seems to be a little bit of thread throughout the whole event, through all of our speakers. Again, even though we were trying to get to the Q&As at the end, please still ask the questions that you have for Benoit throughout the session, and we will try and get to as many as possible after the presentation, and if not, Benoit will be able to respond to your questions after the event. So without further ado, Benoit, I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I appreciate. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this conversation around processes. I assume most of you can relate with this topic. Ops and processes kind of go hand in hand. And the term process itself, I feel, is being used a million times a day, at least in my environment. Through my career, always heard processes being thrown here and there. What is the process? Who is the owner of the process? What is the next step in the process? We need a process. Those are terms that I keep hearing again and again and again. And so I just wanted to take a minute and talk about it, create this conversation topic with all of you, and stoke the conversation and see maybe where that leads us. Let me see. There you go. So the way I see it is processes are kind of a lighthouse guiding teams throughout our metaphoric storms. I'm sure every company has their metaphoric storms, and having those processes are a good way to fall back on that. But I was just wondering, should they be the alpha and omega of a profession? That is the beginning and the end of everything we do. Should we be bound by our processes, or should we allow some space for improvisation? I know it's a term that usually doesn't go very well with ops, but hear me out. I can imagine some people already feeling a bit restless with the idea of going off process. And actually, to be honest, you may be right. But again, for the sake of this conversation, let's continue with this topic. So for today, again, as I was saying, I would like to take the time to review pros and cons of being bound by a process. And let me elaborate on what I mean by that. There's a question I ask to my colleagues, to my peers very often. I'm quite curious. And what I want to know is how rigid they are with their processes. I know that some people just stick to what was established and they will never deviate. And some people are okay to open to a little compromise, being okay to, do with whatever is needed in the situation. Before we get there, I just want to do a quick intro of myself, and I think that'll help us with the conclusion of the conversation later on. But hi again, my name is Benoit Guizol. I'm currently working as the Design Program Manager for Meta in one of their Singapore offices. I was born and raised in France. That's in the city in the first picture you can see on the screen. And I have lived and worked in the US, the UK, and now in Singapore. Again, I try to pick photos that, make sense. I have been quite nomadic geographically, but also with my professions. I've worked in very different jobs, very different industries. I've done a lot of sidestepping, backstepping, and then leaping forward. But some of the jobs I've done, for example, include graphic design, project management, translation, ops management, and currently doing program management. I made this quick doodle, which I think illustrates my career trajectory pretty well. And you might be wondering right now why I'm, showing that and why I'm talking about that. And the reason is simple. Looking back on my career, I think my personal background has a lot of influence on the way I answered the question I mentioned earlier. How rigid are you with your processes? And I imagine I'm giving a little bit away with that squiggle there, but let's continue and see where that leads us. So back to the topic, processes. On a side note, don't try to read what's on the picture. I just made it blurry, so don't get distracted by that. But I thought it would be interesting, even though we all know, I think I would assume what processes are, it would be interesting to just like define it real quick so we're all on the same page. The definition from the Oxford Dictionary is quite straightforward. And to be honest, all the other definitions I came across were slight variation of that. They're all very similar as well. A process is a series of things that are done in order to achieve a particular result. What does that mean? Well, first, we need to establish goals, and in other words, what needs to be accomplished. It's usually framed within a brief. Second, steps and tasks. The first element, as the definition implies, is the repeatability of the task. You may not need to set a process if the task you're doing is just going to be a one and done type of thing, but the fact that it's repeatable or that it will be repeated in the future means that we want to structure the work in a way that ensures scalability with a high level of excellence in the task output. We want to make sure basically that the success is repeatable. Number three, roles and responsibilities. This is to help with the division of labor. Each of our cross-functional partners have their own area of expertise, and the process should make sure that it takes that into account. Basically, we want to make sure that people are working on what they're the strongest. I feel that in general, disputes around processes tend to erupt when people are tasked to do things outside of their job description. So again, I think that's an important step. It's also important, I think, to define responsibility for signing off, to try to avoid the good old too many cooks in your kitchen. Finally, time and deadlines. What would be a good process without timeline management? This helps ensure that the process stays on track and is completed with a reasonable time frame. There are many other elements I think we could list here, but just for the sake of our conversation and the brevity of that presentation, I thought we can stick to those four. And so I thought, yeah, these are our main point. They can take many shapes, depending on the industries you're working in, but to some degrees, it's always a variation of that. I see the process in that regard as kind of a map that we'll be using through the project, and the process acting as a GPS to make sure that everybody stays on course. Another step I wanted to highlight before we get to the meat of the matter is the way information is collected during the creation of the process. And what I mean by that, I think it's reasonable to assume that the goal of the process is to solve a human problem, at least within the creative fields we're working in. And this is a statement that might age poorly as AI comes after our jobs, but I think for the time being, we can still say that humans and their whole array of emotions are the core of our work. And this is the case for every phases of the processes. I'd like to insist on that because I think it's also relevant to the conclusion of today's discussion that humans are at the center of our processes. So personally, I like to consult all the cross-functional partners involved in the project and understand their needs, understand the work they need to do, and the time they will need to do it. From my personal experience, I have an idea of the answer to some of those questions, but I think it's important to hear it also from the partners to help build accountability and trust between you and your partners. That's not me, by the way, on the photo, but that's the kind of approach I'm talking about. So now that all this information has been laid out, I think it's time to formalize it so you can share your shiny new process with the stakeholders. And this is where today's conversation really starts. So you've done all the groundwork. You have written down each steps and tasks that the team needs to repeat. You've identified all the stakeholders and who has the power to give a final sign-off for each phase. You've validated your timelines, and everything has been formalized on paper or most probably on a digital document. You shared it with everyone. You even went to the extent of setting up a process review meeting during which every cross-functional partner was nodding their head in approval. You know which meeting I'm talking about. It's the one which from which every partner left with, a smile on their face, a certain sense of satisfaction that the new process was there to help them through the new project, season, quarter, year, you name it. And 1 week in, and the first challenge to the process is surfacing. Everybody seemed on board during that meeting a week ago, and yet here we are, someone is already asking you to make an exception to your process, just this one time. And so we're back to the question I was asking at the beginning. How rigid are you with your processes? Now you have two options opening to you. Option one, no way, there's a process and there's a reason for it. They will figure it out. Option number two, you agree to compromise and decide to make an exception, just this one time. All right, you picked option number one and decided you're not deviating from the course initially planned. And I think that's a commendable attitude. It's your process, it's your shit. To be more in line actually with this slide, probably I think we can say it's the map guiding you and your team through the forest, to go back to the analogy from earlier. I feel that a solid, well-defined process, and when you don't deviate from it, it really helps guide the teams back and to fall back on that process at every stage of a project. Even if things get complicated, there's always a map to go back to that will guide you to the end of the project. At least that's the idea. And for that reason, I think it would be pretty unwise to start poking holes through the map, meaning starting to, deviate from what you had agreed with everybody in the early stages. I like this analogy because I think it really highlights that, you need to find your way through the months and the weeks of your process, of your project. And beyond all the thrash and the swirls that may come along, your process will be that old reliable map that will guide you through your destination. So you're engraving your process in stone. And because having that clarity for your process is important, you decide to make it immovable. I think one of the benefits is that it ensures that every team member, regardless of their position, has access to the same information, tools, and resources needed to complete their work. This helps to prevent any unfair advantages or privileges for certain team members. In such scenario, everyone is held to the same standards. This limits accidental favoritism or bias, as everyone is evaluated based on the same criteria. Additionally, a rock-solid process can help increase transparency with the organization. Typically, it's good for leadership to have this 30,000 feet view on what's going on. If the process is clear and everybody is following it, it's much easier for them to track what's happening and at each moment in time. Finally, when a design team has a rock-solid process in place, it also helps to standardize the work and create a consistent output. As mentioned in the slide before, this means that everyone on the team is working from the same set of guidelines, tools, and resources, and everyone is sharing of the standards and expectations for the project. Having a repeatable process also helps teams to become more efficient and productive. Contributors can focus on refining and improving their work, rather than wasting time and resources on figuring out what they need to do each time. It makes managing a budget more predictable and therefore easier to do. It also helps timelines, which makes them easier to hit, since there's clear expectation of bandwidth costs for each of the phases. Also, a rock-solid process enables a team to measure and track its progress by establishing clear benchmarks and goals. This helps to ensure that the team is always making steady progress towards their objective, and also, I guess, always improving. So to sum it up, there are a lot of benefits to keeping a rigid stance towards your processes. I think you can start with, as we mentioned, it promotes fairness by providing a clear and consistent framework for all the team members to follow. It ensures that everyone has clear opportunities to contribute to the project and achieve their goals, regardless of their background, experience, or connection with the organization. It helps standardize expectations on projects' output. It saves time and resources, and it helps measure progress for the work quality, speed, or efficiency over time. I mean, when you lay it out like that, I think it sounds perfect. And yet, as I'm adding gray hair to my head day after day, and which is probably due of my processes being challenged on occasion, I realize that things are not always so clear-cut. So let's pretend for a second, for the sake of this conversation, that you decided to pick option 2 to the question earlier. So you're probably familiar with this quote from Bruce Lee. Funny enough, it's engraved on a fountain just at the entrance of my office building. So I'm wondering if it's what spurred the idea of making that presentation. But it goes like this. Be like water making its way through cracks. Do not be assertive, but adjust to the object, and you shall find a way around it or through it. If you put your process into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put your process into a bottle and it becomes the bottle. You put it into a team and it becomes the team. May the process be water, my friend. So obviously I've altered a little bit the quote because as far as I know, Bruce Lee didn't delve into creative ops. But nonetheless, the idea is that you must be water, my friend. I may need to unpack a little bit what I mean by that. And so let me give you an example. Typically, one of the teams in your org would need to go through a set of reviews and approvals to get their products out on the market. Typically, let's say it takes 3 months to go through all these sets of reviews and approval before the product can be launched. The thing is, someone on the team believes that before rolling this out to the general public, they will like to do a quick experiment in a size-limited market, learn from the experiment, and refine the product as needed, and then would launch to general audience. In order to do so, they need to go fast, and they need to bypass all reviews and launch right away in that small market. So you may disagree with it, but I think it's worth a consideration. I think also one may consider it's essential to remain flexible in our work environment and to be able to amend process if needed due to the human nature of work. As I mentioned earlier, relationships and unplanned happenstance just are part of our daily task and daily work. Processes are designed to provide structure and guidance to the team, but they can't always account for the unexpected events that can arise during a project. Remember this slide? I was telling you how important it is to consider the human aspect of the work, at least until AI takes over our jobs. It is important to integrate the human value at the core of our work and the fact that the overwhelming majority of our decisions are based on emotions rather than hard facts. There are a trove of scholarly articles actually talking about this topic, the fact that we make most of our decisions based on emotions. And so if it's the case, and if all those decisions are made that way, I think it's worth considering our approach to process management in a certain flexible way to accommodate for this unpredictability of the human psyche. In many industries today, the environment in which projects are taking place is constantly evolving. There may be technological advancements, changes in industry standards, or changes in the market trends that require the team to bypass steps or their process to remain relevant and effective. Another factor to take in consideration is that companies go more and more through reorganizations, which means that the approval chain may change halfway through a project, or that a project will be co-owned by a team another team moving forward. And so all the process you had established before needs to be amended, or some steps need to be skipped along the way. Usually this leads to, you going back to the drawing table, creating a new process, or at least refining your process. But I also think that all those events help underline that sometimes work needs to be governed by common sense over processes. What I mean by that is that you need to remain flexible along the way and make calls on the fly, and make sure that the team you're working with is able to deliver that project at some point and not be a roadblock for them. As the saying goes, done is better than perfect. I'm giving you the corporate translation of the message on the screen. And so I know that we would all love for each of our projects or products to be shipped with a top-notch execution and quality, but it's not always possible. My take is that ops managers do need to compromise on occasions. There are a lot of benefits that come with an immovable process, some of which we discuss here, and maybe many actually we haven't covered. Again, time constraint. But ultimately, I also think that while work is still governed, executed, and servicing human beings, we need to take into account the human condition and accept that sometimes we may need to have to adapt to certain challenges. Thank you for your time, for listening to me. I'm generally curious about your take on the matter. So if you want to stick around and ask questions, I'm staying here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. As you started the presentation, you know, ops and process goes hand in hand. It certainly does. And, you know, I know that, you know, you've got this fine line between being rigid with your processes, but also allowing to get stuff done, and also dealing with, you know, the human side of what it takes to actually deliver.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you picked up on the goal of the process, and I'm going to use this in my team. The goal of the process is to solve a human problem in the creative space. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
You know, often my team says to me, you know, what's our North Star? And that's a great North Star, is to solve our human problems in the creative space.
Yeah.
I love it.
I agree. And I think it's easy to focus on more minute, you know, part of your daily work, but ultimately what you're doing is helping human beings do their work to the best they can. So then they can produce products and, you know, items, campaigns, whatever, that are great, but also servicing in the end an audience, also human beings, right?
Sure, absolutely. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, actually, or a few questions from the audience now. I will ask, so Michael has asked, how do you deal with challenge resistance in the organization when introducing process changes? You know, have you got a carrot and stick measure in place?
I do. So to be honest, I'm not super fond of the stick part of things. And I feel that's where, you know, going back to that slide about meeting with people, when I was saying, I think it's important, even if you know better, even I think if you have a long experience in the domain and you've been through different companies, you've, you know, have your proven format and you know, template that you want to apply, I think it's still important to go meet with people, explain what you're trying to achieve, hear from them what the pain points are, what their daily challenges are, and collaborate throughout all the work. Sometimes I think it can be difficult in the sense that you feel then the final work is not just you, because it was work, you know, ideas you took from other people and, you know, input you took from other people. But since that process is supposed to make work, you know, everybody together, and I think it's really important to have that aspect of collaboration, and relationship building is essential to that aspect.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I do find also, if you listen to people and listen to people's problems and challenges, you know, even though they can be overcome with the process that you're trying to deliver, sometimes they can't see that, but just by having a platform where they can be felt to be heard, that's really powerful.
100%.
And you know, and I could even add also, you know, when you have got that resistance to change, if you are answering their human problems with your process, then there's very little comeback. You know, if you can prove that this is your problem, this is how I think we're going to address it. sometimes that resistance to change kind of disappears because they feel that you're both pulling in the same direction.
I agree. And having also, I think, people's input really have them be involved in the entire process so I think that helps limit resistance, because part of what we're doing is based on what they said. And so I think it helps with that. But yeah.
And also, if somebody else thinks it's their idea, brilliant. Don't care whose idea it was. If it's sold, then let's go with it.
100%.
Yeah. So a question here from Pfizer. Have you ever been in a situation where you're left with no cup and bottle? If so, how do you overcome that?
Left with no what? Sorry, I didn't hear.
Cup and bottle.
Yeah. I think I would need to think about that, but no.
Yeah.
Ultimately, so the reason I'm came up with this whole story, right, and the whole presentation is because I'm really asking this question to people I'm working with, and on several occasions I met peers who were like, no, I'm dead set, we won't change. For me, I was willing to adapt, and I think it's true, it's a very tricky way of handling things, because then also you need to make sure there's still a model in place. So I think that's where you need to find actually kind of in between. I would tend to say, like, you need to have a very strong and established process, but then have that flexibility when needs be. But as what all the points I made, about the strong and written process and like set in stone process, I also firmly believe in those. So again, I think it's just a question of like giving a little bit leeway when is needed. But I think the person who asked that question has a very good point. You need to be very careful that it doesn't go too far, and that can be a tricky part. But that's the human aspect of the whole thing. That's where the EQ is so important, I think, in the jobs we do.
Sure.
You need to have that emotional understanding and intelligence to yeah.
And I guess, I was thinking as you were talking, it really isn't black and white, because yes, you can have a fundamental process of how to get from start to finish, but some projects, some campaigns, they are going to require a deviation from that process that you've got, to make it easier for everybody else. So, as per your argument, I don't think there is a right or wrong. I think you just find it out as you go.
Yeah. And to be honest, that's what makes the job interesting, I think. Because if we just had to implement process, then I guess we would come into a company, set up a process, and then leave. And
that's it.
So thankfully, that's like that, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Thankfully. So Nina, she's currently reviewing her processes within her team. Some of the opinions are they're too rigid. Others like the sureness of knowing, what the next step is, and they thrive on that rigidness. Is there a way that you can suggest to combine the two approaches to the process, or are we best, as you had on that slide, to pick a lane and then refine and review from there?
I would lean more towards the latter, in the sense that I think it's good from the get-go to give that map, to continue the analogy, and just have a clear map. And that's the ideal case scenario. But for you, in the back of your mind, be ready for drawing new path on your map if needed. But I wouldn't introduce this at the beginning stage when you're preparing everything, because I would be scared that introduces confusion. And I think the simpler and the clearer you can deliver what the process will be, it's going to be helpful in the long run. So, yeah.
Okay. And let me check the time. Stephen said he loves the water analogy. I personally love the water analogy as well. He said, my experience is that the participants in a process act as water, finding cracks and shortcuts to bypass it. I think we can all identify with that comment.
Very good comments.
Yeah. Does a process need a sponsor or an owner?
I would say that the owner is you, but sponsor, I would think it's also important to have somebody higher up in the chain that has your back.
Yeah.
That helps, I think, getting a buy-in also from cross-functional partners. So I would highly, encourage you to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think we may actually be at the top of the presentation. So I guess I'd like to extend my thanks for your presentation and thanks for your engagement, and also, thank you for the audience for the wonderful questions that you that they asked, and your answers as well. I think throughout this whole event, there's been a common thread through the presentations that I've been capturing. The common thread has kind of been finding great talent, nurturing talent, because teams and human beings are precious. Communication is key, open communication, as we were talking about it, listening and practicing opening listening. Really hear what the other side is saying and what their pain points are. And also with your team to lead with empathy. Two more sort of topics or themes or threads that I found really interesting throughout today is that, we've got many stakeholders, many opinions, finding out who those final stakeholders are and actually asking that question and putting it on the brief at the start, and to try to make sure that they're in the review process earlier on, way before the final ta-da presentation. I think that is going to create a lot of efficiency. So, more tissue meetings, more getting together. Again, it goes back to more collaboration, more communication, and just being human. So I'm going to steal one of your quotes because I thought they were lovely. I'm going to say to everybody on the call, everybody who attended the event, to go forth and continue to be that lighthouse guiding your teams through the metaphorical storms. Be water, my friends. Have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Benoit. And thank you to everybody who has enjoyed the event. And we'll see you perhaps next time.